this is Jacob Heilbrunn, the editor of The National Interest, and my guest today on our podcast In the National Interest is none other than Curt Mills, who is currently the editor of The American Conservative and previously worked as a reporter at The National Interest. Welcome, Curt.
Good to be here.
Curt, it is a momentous day. The Senate approved the Ukraine aid bill by a vote of 79 to 18. However, 112 members of the House GOP voted against the bill and 110 voted for it. What explains the upsurge in indifference, if not hostility, to Ukraine aid among the Republican Party?
Yeah, I think this has been a long time coming. I think first for at least 10 years, if not arguably longer, with progenitors such as Pat Buchanan, Ross Perot, even the Rand Paul libertarian boomlet of the early 2010s, there has been a building restraint-oriented foreign policy wing of the Republican Party. And the anti-establishment took control of the boat in 2016. And it's been a complex, winding road, but they have not relinquished it, more or less. Where there has been slower momentum is down ballot, but 10 years is not a small amount of time. And you are beginning to see shifts in the legislature, most principally in the House, which has more elections, frankly, but also among a more vocal cadre of senators. So while this aid passed, it almost didn't. The numbers, the margins are misleading. Speaker Johnson could have easily not brought this legislation to the floor, as was wanted by the grassroots and was intermittently wanted by Mar-a-Lago. And additionally, all said and done, a majority of the House Republican Conference, as you alluded to, voted against this, meaning that Johnson has violated the so-called Hastert rule, which is to never bring legislation to the floor or, see to the passage of something that only a minority of his constituents as speaker want to see happen. So it's a clear win for the White House, but I also think it's a clear win in momentum for restraint and the anti-establishment GOP team.
Curt, how long could the GOP seriously adhere to a rule that was conceived and executed by a known pedophile?
It's not a very fortunate moniker for the rule, I do concede. But I think a rename is perhaps in order. And I think the principle, which has nothing to do with what former Representative Hastert was convicted of, can stay, which is that the Speaker of the House is the closest thing that we have in American politics to an analog with a European prime minister, which is he or she ultimately represents the will of a majority of his own party and thus controls the most populist and lowest chamber of representation in American government, the House of Representatives. And clearly, Johnson crossing this line will have major consequences. And he has survived today, but we have to rewind. And I'm not forecasting this. I think base case Johnson does survive politically through the election if he's even interested in that. But rewind to last spring, then Speaker McCarthy brought over the finish line a similarly divisive piece of legislation in late May, early June. And Speaker McCarthy saw his speakership collapse within 2 financial quarters.
But Curt, for all your disapprobation directed towards this bill, why did Donald Trump draw in his horns? He gave Mike Johnson the leeway to pursue this, which he did successfully.
I think Trump, for both good and ill, obviously has a personalistic style of rule and politics. And I think he currently has the personal favor of Mr. Johnson. And additionally, his preferred style of handling the Ukraine conflict will also be personal. And so it could be argued that he would want to maintain this leverage if he was in power. I think it was a milquetoast support at the end of the day, but you are correct. He did not throw in with the true hard line. That is people like Representative Marjorie Taylor Greene, Representative Thomas Massie, Representative Paul Gosar, people that wanted to see Johnson gone, potentially still do. You're right. He could have done more, but he went quite far.
So it does seem like this is a make or break year for Ukraine. They've got a pile of American aid coming. The Europeans are ramping up their efforts. And President Biden has apparently been sending ATACMs secretly to Ukraine. If this results in a significant Ukrainian successes over the next 6 months, would you still say it was a waste of money and effort, or would you say that maybe Biden had it right?
Well, I'll have what you are having, Jacob, if you think that the Ukrainians are going to make significant advances on the battlefield in the next 6 months.
I didn't postulate. I didn't postulate that they would. I just said if they do.
It's a little bit like saying, do you think, Jacob, that there's something to Trumpism if Trump wins by 40 vote points in the popular vote?
No, what I'm trying to flesh out is whether you are simply indifferent to, you think it's simply a bad idea regardless of the consequences.
I'll answer the question directly, and then I'll answer the broader question. I don't think this will make a meaningful difference in the war. I think this will get more people killed. I think the steel man of this allotment is that this will give the Ukrainians time and a little more leverage to negotiate now and potentially end the war. But I have no faith that's what the Zelensky government is going to do with this aid, because they haven't gesticulated in that direction whatsoever. So I think you have a dangerous, irresponsible government in Kyiv that the U.S. should be pulling support from, or at least not maximizing it. Second,
go ahead.
Well, secondly, I think it's a long-standing position. I don't think it's worth risking nuclear war over control of the eastern provinces of Ukraine.
I was with Simon Schuster this morning, who's written a book about Zelensky called The Showman, and he is a senior correspondent at Time. And one of the things that he reveals in his book is that even as the war raged in the early weeks and months, Zelensky was offering permanent neutrality of Ukraine, which the Russians did not accept. So I disagree with your view of the Zelensky government is intractable and irresponsible.
Fair enough. I do think that the reporting is contradictory and shrouded about those months. That's one report. And, I'm not taking umbrage from Mr. Schuster's work. I'm not familiar enough with it to comment on its veracity now, but I do know that there's reports to the contrary. And so we don't know that much about this part of the world, which is another reason I am leery of getting involved militarily. But secondly, I would also postulate that there are limits on how relevant 24 months ago really are. A brutal war has ensued, emotions have hardened, and visions have become more blinkered. In 2022, February, so 27 months ago, Emmanuel Macron was arguably the most restraint-oriented major European leader trying to prevent this war, famously being mocked for his efforts to negotiate with the Kremlin and Putin. And now, today, if you read the headlines, Macron is the absolute tip of the spear, a hawk of hawks. So how Mr. Zelensky may or may not have behaved at the outset of the war, I think, is less relevant than how he's behaving now.
Curt, let's switch to another conflict, the Middle East. There was just an election in Pennsylvania that was quite interesting. It looks like it's summertime in Pittsburgh, by which I mean that Summer Lee, the congresswoman, survived a primary challenge, and she has refused to vote for aid to Israel and is in the progressive wing of the Democratic Party. What do you think is brewing among the Democrats and the progressives when it comes to Israel, coupled with the mass protests that we now see on college campuses?
Yeah, I think it's very significant. I think there's in one respect, a mirror image of the Republican Party. Although there were votes in the Republican Party, I believe a little over 20 that voted against Israel aid as well. But I believe you can look at the Democrat coalition as emerging towards something like a majority in the years or even months to come, being net Israel skeptic, or at least not Israel maximalist, like Representative Lee. I think this is a dynamic that's been a long time coming. I do think it is in conflict with the party's establishment, and contra the Republican establishment, the Democratic establishment is actually quite powerful and extremely well financed. And I think for President Biden, this is a no-win scenario. The more we are talking as Americans about Israel, the more Biden is in trouble. It's quite like abortion with Mr. Trump. It doesn't matter that Mr. Biden's position on Israel is actually quite nuanced. And it doesn't matter that Mr. Trump's position on abortion is actually quite nuanced. It is a toxic asset on each of their balance sheets. They can't explain it quickly, and it frustrates voters. And so the more that these types of conversations are had, the more the protests are occurring, it's bad for Biden. And then I think I would just quickly point out that this country has had arguably a protest movement in some form or other since the middle of last decade, if not earlier, on college campuses and in urban centers around elections. In 2020, it was famously for Black Lives Matter, and Biden was elected the president. And I believe that sort of shock troop presence in the streets was a net gain for the Democrats. At the end of the day, it will be interesting to see if this is now turned on the beneficiary himself, and that he is actually blamed for the urban disquiet, for the campus disquiet, much like his predecessor, Mr. Trump, was 4 years ago.
Now, Curt, you mentioned that some 20 Republicans also voted against aid to Israel, and Tucker Carlson recently inveighed against Israel's actions in the Gaza Strip. Do you think that there will be a turn in the Republican Party away from its previous reflexive support for Israel?
I think a lot of it depends on the course of the war and the course of the government. Israel itself is a nation divided. I mean, Netanyahu, if he's not going to lead Israel, might be imprisoned by Israel. So it's not entirely much like Mr. Trump. So it's not entirely clear what these entities are. So, if Netanyahu were to lose, or the Israelis were to become less hawkish, or this conflict were to suddenly die down, I think this would put some quiet on the subject. But yes, the critique that was always levied at Mr. Netanyahu about 10 years ago when he first addressed the House of Representatives, or I believe the joint session of Congress in the late Obama term, over the JCPOA, was once you throw in with one party in an American political context, you risk the bipartisan support forever. And not only would he lose the Democrats, he could potentially lose the level of vigor they had previously from the Republicans. And I think that prophecy is somewhat coming true.
Curt, I'd like to thank you for coming on this podcast again. I'd like to also alert listeners that if you're interested, Curt's magazine recently ran a denunciation of yours truly as returning to the neocon camp, which you can find on the American Conservative website. And I look forward to our next conversation.
Cheers.